Is G heritable? In a certain sense, yes. In the 1950s, a series of reports suggested a strong genetic component. Of these, twin studies were the most definitive when identical twins who had been reared together, that is, with shared genes and shared environments, were tested in the early 50s. Psychologists had found a striking degree of concordance in their IQs, with a correlation value of 0.86. So the footnote, more recent estimates have pinned the correlation between identical twins to 0.6 and 0.7. When the 1950s data was re-examined in subsequent decades by several psychologists, including Leo Kannon, the methodologies used were found to be suspect and the initial estimates called into question. In the late 80s, continuing, when identical twins who were separated at birth and reared separately were tested, the correlation fell to 0.74, still a striking number. But the heritability of a trait, no matter how strong, may be the result of multiple genes. Well, yes, of course, each exerting a relatively minor effect. If that was the case, identical twins would show strong correlation in G, but parents and children would be far less concordant. IQ followed this pattern. The correlation between parents and children living together, for instance, fell to 0.42. With parents and children living apart, the correlation collapsed to 0.22. Whatever the IQ test was measuring, it was a heritable factor, but one also influenced by many genes and possibly strongly modified by environment, part nature and part nurture. To me, that seems completely in agreement with the bell curve. The most logical conclusion from these facts is that while some combination of genes and environments can strongly influence G, this combination will rarely be passed intact from parents to their children. Mendel's laws virtually guarantee that the particular permutation of genes will scatter apart in every generation, and environmental interactions are so difficult to capture and predict that they cannot be reproduced over time. Intelligence, in short, is heritable, that is, influenced by genes, but not easily inheritable, that is, moved down intact from one generation to the next. Seems also completely in agreement. Why do people read the bell curve and interpret it such a radical way? Had Murray and Herrnstein reached these conclusions, they would have published an accurate, if rather uncontroversial, book on the inheritance of intelligence. But I think that is what they did. So that's why I'm consistently thinking of it as accurate. But the molten centerpiece of the bell curve is not the heritability of IQ, but its racial distribution. Well, but they do have to deal with the statistics. Murray and Herrnstein began by reviewing 156 independent studies that had compared IQs between races. Taken together, these studies had found an average IQ of 100 for whites. By definition, the average IQ of the index population has to be 100. And 85 for African Americans, a 15-point difference. Murray and Herrnstein tried somewhat valiantly to ferret out the possibility that the tests were biased against African Americans. They limited the tests to only those administered after 1960 and only given outside the South, hoping to curtail endemic biases, but the 15-point difference persisted. Could the difference in black-white IQ scores be a result of socioeconomic status? That impoverished children, regardless of race, perform worse in IQ tests had been known for decades. Indeed, of all the hypotheses concerning the difference in racial IQs, this was by far the most plausible, and I think, by the way, the one that Murray and Herrnstein stress. That the vast part of the black-white difference may be the consequence of the overrepresentation of poor African American children. In the 1990s, the psychologist Eric Turkheimer strongly validated this theory by demonstrating that genes play a rather minor role in determining IQ in severely impoverished circumstances. If you superpose poverty, hunger, and illness on a child, then these variables dominate the influence on IQ. Genes that control IQ only become significant if you remove these limitations. Absolutely. It is easy to demonstrate an analogous effect in a lab. If you raise two plant strains, one tall and one short, in undernourished circumstances, then both plants grow short, regardless of intrinsic genetic drive. In contrast, when nutrients are no longer limiting, the tall plant grows to its full height. Whether genes or environment, nature or nurture dominates in influence depends on context. When environments are constraining, they exert a disproportionate influence. When the constraints are removed, genes become ascendant. Bottom note, there can hardly be more cogent genetic argument for equality. It is impossible to ascertain any human's genetic potential without first equalizing environments. Agreed. But that's also written in such a way that it seems like he's suggesting that, as he says, genetic argument for equality, but it actually does both. I mean, if there are genetic differences that are significant, those will out. Height, for example. I never did get onto basketball teams. I was at 5'6". I wasn't very competitive, even though some 5'6" people are. The effects of poverty and deprivation offered a perfectly reasonable cause for the overall black-white difference in IQ. But Murray and Herrnstein dug deeper. Even correcting for socioeconomic status, they found the black-white score difference could not be fully eliminated. If you plot a curve of IQ of whites and African Americans across increasing socioeconomic status, the IQ increases in both cases, as expected. Wealthier children certainly score better than their poorer counterparts, both in white and in African American populations, yet the difference between the IQ scores across races persists. And that, actually, I agree, that's something that Herrnstein and Murray seem to argue. Indeed, paradoxically, the difference increases as you increase the socioeconomic status of whites and African Americans. This do seem to match the statistics. The difference in IQ scores between wealthy whites and wealthy African Americans is even more pronounced. Far from narrowing, the gap widens at the top brackets of income. Quarts and quarts of ink have been spilled in books, magazines, scientific journals, and newspapers analyzing, cross-examining, and debunking these results. In a blistering article written for The New Yorker, for instance, the evolutionary biologist Stephen Jay Gould, The Mismeasure of Man, I remember reading that, both versions, he updated it in response to this book, argued that the effect was far too mild, and the variation within tests was far too great. To make any statistical conclusions about the difference, the Harvard historian Orlando Patterson, in the slyly titled "For Whom the Bell Curves,"